I remember, we've been talking about the war in Ukraine various times, and today is December 1st, 2025.
Mm.
We're approaching 4 years of this war, this devastating war in Ukraine. How do you see the current situation of the negotiations on the part of the United States? And we know tomorrow Steve Witkoff going to be in Russia talking with Russian officials with Vladimir Putin. How do you see the position of
Mm.
Europeans? How do you see the position of the United States and the way that they may break a deal? They may break a deal with Russia. How is that possible?
I'm glad you mentioned the date, Monday, 1st December, and tomorrow's meeting in Moscow between Putin and Witkoff and also Yared Kushner, I understand, because actually it's tomorrow's meeting, I think, or meetings that is the crucial one, and it's after that we'll have a much clearer idea as to whether or not this so-called peace proposal, peace plan, is going to work or not. I mean, well, one of your questions is very easy to answer, which is to do with the Europeans, yeah, because Europeans basically they've been trying to scupper this deal, been trying to sabotage it. Yeah, they don't want this deal to go through. They want the war to go on at least for a bit longer. They've talked to the Americans about it, and basically they've tried to introduce amendments to the so-called 28-point peace plan, which would effectively nullify and make it an impossible peace plan. But they failed. Obviously, the Americans have listened. Yeah, the Europeans have spun it to say, "Oh well, we've come up with a plan which is this, that, and the other." But it didn't strike me that the European input hasn't had any impact on this process. And well, the Europeans have been sidelined. Yeah. Now, as far as all the other actors in this um, uh, process, things are a bit more complicated. But there are some things I think which are fairly clear, and which we know. And we know that there is this peace proposal, right, devised by the Americans in consultation with the Russians. Okay, and I think it's important to okay, this is this is an American proposal, right? But it wouldn't have been formulated and tabled in the way in which it has been if it didn't have substantial consent on the part of the Russians, right? The second point is this is not okay. The kind of plan, like in one sense, came out of the blue. It was a bit of a surprise for everyone to a certain extent. But actually, it's not a new plan. It's not a new proposal, right? These consultations, these discussions between the Americans and Russians have been going on for a long time, right? Until way back, until before the Alaska summit. And in fact, by the time of the Alaska summit, the Americans and Russians, my understanding, actually had a broad agreement on a deal to end the Ukraine war. But Trump in Alaska wasn't, or the Americans anyway in general, weren't willing to sign off on one of the crucial Russian demands, which was that the Ukrainians should withdraw from the areas of the Donbass that they still occupy, right? But obviously that problem, that obstacle to a deal has been removed because, of course, one of the fundamental points of this American plan includes precisely that point. Okay, but so this is a it's been quite a prolonged process. Of course, it's still ongoing now. In the process, of course, the policy positions, the proposals have been changed, have been refined. Including, I would expect, as a result of the Americans' recent conversations with the Ukrainians, both in Geneva and then again in Florida just recently. But I don't see any sign that there's been any fundamental transformation in the character of the plan from the one that has been the 28-point peace plan, which has been made public. I'm sure there have been changes, refinements. I'm sure there have been quite a few concessions to Ukrainian demands and sensibilities, but I don't see any evidence of any fundamental shift. And then the other thing that's also important here, of course, is that Putin, the Russian side, has indicated, has stated that this plan, which they've now received a copy of, is a suitable basis for discussion for a peace settlement, and that's why Witkoff and Kushner are in Moscow, right? And that's what they're going to be talking about. I think the other point I'd like to make about the American proposal is that it's actually a very good plan in the sense of being a very good deal for the Ukrainians. Yeah, the Americans, Trump has managed to extract from the Russians quite a lot of concessions, which are favourable to Ukraine. I think, the Americans the American side, Trump have played their cards very well, and they've come up with a deal that doesn't get any better as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. So all this talk there is in the Western media about Trump capitulating to Russia's maximalist demands, completely not the case. What the American proposal embodies is actually a watered down version of the Russians' minimalist program. That's what the Americans actually have achieved.
One of the points you mentioned, the Bassett, the case of territorial concessions, but Jeff, in this plan, we don't know what were the changes that were asked by Europeans together with the Ukrainian delegations in Geneva or in Florida. Do you think what are the most sensitive issues with the case of, the 28-point plan on the part of the United States and
Well, look, we can only go on the basis of what's been reported in the media, and what's been reported in the media is basically the Europeans have been trying to nullify the territorial and security elements of the 28 points, which is the most important part of the plan. But as far as I can see, they haven't succeeded, and they haven't succeeded because were the American side to actually do what the Europeans want them to do, it would absolutely kill off the plan, because it's quite clear, and the Americans know this, that Russia won't accept what the Europeans are trying to achieve there, which is why, of course, the Americans in the first place have actually come up with a plan which actually involves various territorial concessions to the Russians. So the Americans know exactly what the situation is. So I don't think we should concern ourselves too much with European manoeuvres. As I say, I don't think they've succeeded. If they had succeeded, then the whole thing has been a charade. It's been a waste of time, right? And I don't think that's the case, right? First, Ukrainians, I'm sure the Ukrainians, they too have been trying to get some fundamental changes in the territorial and security aspects of life, i.e., the territorial concessions, the withdrawal of their forces from the Donbass, and also the whole issue of Ukraine's membership of NATO, and then the whole issue of the American security guarantee. Yeah, I'm sure the Ukrainians have been trying to do the same thing as the Europeans have, but the Ukrainians having to tread a lot more carefully, don't they? Because they know if they outright rejected the American plan, then the Americans would walk for the process, and they would be left on their own. So I would imagine, I'm sure the Ukrainians in these discussions have stated their position, which is a well-known position in relation to territorial and security issues. But I would expect them to have focused on areas where they can have some actual discussion with the Americans, and they can actually get some concessions, make some gains, yeah, because they want to come across as being constructive, right? So I think they would have focused on areas where they can put table some counter proposals, which may be quite reasonable and which may well be discussable with the Russians, right? As to what's going to happen next, yeah, okay. So look, the big question here to my mind, is okay. All the signs we have at the moment are that there has been this Russian-American deal. It's that deal was developed in various ways, but it remains more or less intact. And that coming out of this process, there will be a Russian-American deal. It may not be exactly the same as this 28-point plan that has been made public, but I would expect it to be something similar to that, right? So that if you ask me to call it as of this moment, I'd have to say all the signs are pointing to a Russian-American peace deal in relation to Ukraine. What I don't know is going to happen, or I'm not even less certain, if you like, is how the Ukrainians are going to respond to that deal. Are they going to accept it, or are they going to walk away from it and fight on? That I think to my mind, that's not so clear, and maybe isn't clear. Maybe among the Ukrainians themselves, they don't know. They're not sure what they're actually going to do when they come to the moment of decision as to whether or not they go along with this Russian-American peace deal, or whether or not they decide to reject it and fight on. And it's a big decision for the Ukrainians, and it's a tough choice for them, because of course, if they accept a deal, and assuming it's something like the one that's been made public, including territorial conditions, concessions, withdrawals, no NATO membership, Ukraine as a neutral state, all the other provisions as well, which impact on Ukrainian domestic politics. Once they accept that, that's going to create an enormous internal crisis within Ukraine itself, political, social crisis, right? And who knows what the outcome of that crisis is going to be. So Ukrainian thinking might be, well, okay, if we reject this deal, walk away, we know what's going to happen. The war's going to go on, and the chances are in a few months' time, we're going to be faced with having to accept, whether we like it or not, an even worse deal. But if we accept the deal that's on the table now, that's just good. That's going to create an enormous kind of internal domestic catastrophe for us. So we might as well just hang in there and fight on in the hope that something that something turns up. But it is a very it's a very tough choice that the Ukrainians have to make in relation to whether or not to accept a deal.
I think your point is so important, because you said that it's a difficult choice on the part of Ukrainians, but time is not on their side. Time is not helping them. As time goes by, they're going to lose more. How do you see Europe? Why is that so difficult for Europe to understand it, or they don't care about Ukraine anymore?
Yeah.
They want to continue the war.
On any rational, pragmatic, realistic calculation, the Ukrainians should take the deal. Yeah, because they're losing the war very badly. They're looking at significant military defeat. They're going to end up in a worse, perhaps a much worse, position in the future, the near future, than they are now. For example, in relation to, just give one example, in relation to this, the territorial aspect of the deal, which is this, the thing is about, okay, so the deal on the table is, as far as we understand it, is that the Ukrainians withdraw their forces from those parts of the Donbass which they still occupy, right? And those territories are transferred to the jurisdiction of the Russian Federation, right? Ukraine's so far have said no, they're not going to do it, and not prepared to concede that territory. But in the plan as it stands, what's supposed to happen is that the Ukrainians withdraw from those territories, right? But those areas then become part of a demilitarized zone. Yeah. So the Russians will gain sovereignty over them, so to speak, or jurisdiction over them, but they won't come under Russian military occupation. Now, if the Ukrainians reject the peace deal and fight on, what's going to happen is that militarily, the Russians are going to, okay, it may take a few months, but sooner rather than later, the Russians are going to advance into those territories, unoccupied parts of Donbass, are going to militarily occupy them. But if that happens, the Russians aren't then going to turn around and say, okay, we'll turn these areas into a demilitarized zone. That's not going to happen. If Russia is forced to invade those territories and fight for them and occupy them militarily, they're going to stay in occupation. And also the other part of the deal that's on the table, of course, is that the Russians, according to the plan anyway, are supposed to agree to withdraw their forces from areas of Ukraine which aren't part of the four provinces which they've claimed, i.e., Zaporozhye, Kherson, and the two Donbass oblasts, right? So that's the kind of quid pro quo. Well, if the Ukrainians reject the deal, they're going to lose that concession as well. Okay, so look, on any rational basis, they should be accepting the deal, but it's not necessarily it's not a completely rational decision. It's also a very emotional decision. It's a psychological decision, and also there is, as I've already said, there's a very real calculation to be made as to what's more damaging to Ukraine's internal unity. Is it accepting the deal, or is it not? Or is not accepting the deal? Okay, as far as the Europeans are concerned, well, I think the European consensus in favour of continuing the prosecution of war is disintegrating. Yeah. But for the moment, at the leadership level, that seems to be the position. Now, how do you explain that? Well, I think you partly explain it by the fact that there's a lot of wishful thinking among Europeans about what the actual situation on the battlefield is like, and about the strength of Russia's position, and also the stability of the Putin regime. I think they still have this perception that the Russian position is a lot weaker than it might seem, and if it can be made even more weaker by continuing to fight the war, then that will aid Ukrainian future negotiations. That kind of wishful thinking. Also, all these European politicals, they've invested an enormous amount of political capital in the position that they've taken the Ukraine war. If it comes to an end on the basis of a peace that's largely framed by Russian demands, that's going to be a huge political blow to them, and their position in their own domestic politics in general is also is quite is weak enough anyway. So it's it's a combination of wishful thinking and also becoming prisoners of their own political and ideological rhetoric in relation to Russia and Putin. So when they make all these claims about, well, once Putin has Ukraine and next there'll be the Baltic states, or there's going to be a war in the future with Russia, all those kind of completely ridiculous claims, I think, ridiculous as they are, there's probably an element of genuine belief in the truth of those kind of claims, no matter how much reality might be contrary to it. There is that kind of belief, at least among the more fanatical anti-Russian elements among European politicians.